started painting with watercolors, I very quickly realized how limited my color mixing knowledge really was. I knew the basics. I knew how to look at a color wheel, like a basic artist's color wheel. I knew how you could mix two primary colors together to get a secondary color. I knew what complementary colors were. But outside of that, I had very little color mixing knowledge, and it very quickly came to feel like a limitation in my painting. So I really wanted to dig into that. I wanted to figure out how I could make better predictions, how I could get better at color mixing. So this video is meant to be an introduction to color mixing that covers the bases I wish I saw covered in one video. So I'm gonna start out really, really basic. We're gonna get down to some of those basic terms and then kind of build up our knowledge from there. Just so you're aware, going into this video, I am using Canson XL watercolor paper for most of my examples, just to keep things a little more cost-friendly on my side of things. But be aware that paper will influence the way that your colors appear on the page. So hue, value, and saturation are three different qualities or characteristics of color that can be observed, they can be described, and they can be changed when we are color mixing. So to start out with, hue is probably the easiest one, to me at least, and that's generally just like what we think of when we think of color. That's the color name. So we've got like a green hue, a green hue, and a green hue. So when we are color mixing, oftentimes we are mixing to get a change in hue. As an example, if I wanted to make a green, I could theoretically do that with a blue and a yellow. That's just a hue change or a hue shift that I'm doing by mixing two separate hues together. So that's the easiest, in my opinion, the most straightforward. So then we've got value. Value pertains to the lightness or the darkness of a color. So the more it leans towards white, or the more it leans towards black, really is kind of how I think of it. So any color is going to have its own value range. So the lightest that it can get on its own and the darkest that it can get on its own. And how many possibilities are in there, just depending on the pigment itself, on the paint itself. So if we wanted to lighten our value with watercolor, we can just dilute our paints to do that, to get a lighter value. And we also could add white. Now that's a little bit more taboo in the watercolor world, but it is still a possibility. To darken your value, you can just use your paint as full strength as possible. That's going to be your darkest value that you can get with that pigment on its own. You could also do layers of that paint or that pigment on top of itself, and that would darken your value. When we are dealing with watercolor, there's that transparent nature to it. And the way that we are getting this lighter value is actually through the lightness of the page. And what we're doing when we're layering is we are taking slowly over time, we're getting a little bit less of that lightness through the page. So we're ultimately in both of these, it's about how much of the white shows through from the page. We can also often get a value change if we mix with a complementary color or a darker color or a gray or a neutral tint. That can tend to decrease our value or darken our colors. Just keep in mind when you are mixing colors, if you add more water when you're mixing them, you can get a lighter value of your end result. And if you use more concentrated versions of your paint mixtures, then you will have darker values in general. Different pigments, different colors are also going to have their own value limitations. Saturation refers to the vibrancy or the intensity or the strength or the chroma of a color. And if we're thinking about terms that we often use for desaturated, that might be things like muted or subdued or earthy. A lot of times desaturation is leaning towards brown, it's leaning towards gray, towards black. It can also be leaning towards white. So a pastel color is also a desaturated color. These terms don't exist in isolation and they're not changed in isolation. Sometimes when we are trying to change one of these factors, we do happen to also change another factor or another few factors. For example, if we are changing our value, say we're getting a lighter value, we're also going to get less saturation. So these things can happen together. If we mix hue, for example, if I mix a yellow and a blue and I'm making a green, I am also changing the saturation. The degree of change in saturation will depend on specifics in terms of the pigment that I chose, and in terms of the dilution that I have. But it is good to keep in mind that we are changing the saturation and changing the hue when we're mixing. So I just want you to understand that these three characteristics can all be changed when we are color mixing, and that we have ways of adapting to it. We have ways of kind of predicting some of that, but that some of these things are just going to change in relation to each other. Just so we're on the same page as we're going forward, just a few notes in regards to paint name labeling, the labeling on paint tubes, and pigments and pigment numbers. Our paints are given color through pigments. So we will find on pretty much any tube of paint that's not like super craft grade, I would say, like any student grade paint or professional grade paint, I would expect to see pigment codes on. Some paints will have single pigments, some will have more than one pigment. So this, for example, has 3 pigments in it. And this can be helpful to kind of predict some of the qualities, to be aware of if there are other colors already in a mixture. The pigment code can also tell us a little bit more than, say, the paint name will sometimes tell us. So, for example, this is a sap green. There are loads of different sap greens from different brands, and pretty much all of them look different and have different pigments in them. So, really, getting to know these pigments is going to, in the long run, when you're buying paints and stuff like that, it can be really handy. Just for the purposes of color mixing today, just be aware that pigments have their own qualities that sometimes are good to keep in mind. Things like opacity, things like granulation, and things like staining that will go into your future mixes. When you are getting more comfortable with the color stuff, then I would really suggest focusing in on some of the qualities that you do and don't want in your mixtures. Some people really swear by using single pigment paints for simple mixing, but for the sake of this video, I don't think it really is going to make a huge difference. So just a few more things I want to clarify. Paints that have hue in their name are imitating a paint color that already exists. And the reason that a paint might be doing that could be due to pigment availability. The ingredient might be just hard to access. It could be due to toxicity concerns, things like heavy metals, some people like to avoid in their paints, and cost is also another factor. Hue paints aren't necessarily low quality paints, but they are trying to imitate a different paint. On this red, there's two different red pigments that are in here to try to make this replicatable, to try to make this look like a cadmium red deep. This one is actually just a single pigment. So it doesn't always mean that it is a mixture. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it's just trying to mimic a different color. One more thing to just make you aware of is that some pigments will actually look different in different paints. So both of these paints look different enough. We've got a permanent rose and a purple lake, but they both have the same paint pigment, PV19 and PV19. Another common pigment that can have different looks is PB15. And you might sometimes notice just PB15 on its own, or you might notice PB15 and a colon and then another number, just to indicate the general genre of blue that the PB15 is sitting in. So sometimes we can kind of get an understanding on how a pigment behaves, but just remember that sometimes you will see the same pigment looking slightly different in different paints. So now that we know what hue, saturation, and value are and how our paints are made, we can combine that to look at graphs like this. So what I'm using is artistpigments.org. You can create an account, and then when you can put like your own collections of paints that you have. So what I've done is just like put the paints that I have personally in here. I can see them all. They've got like little swatches and stuff like that. So if I click onto this is what they're calling like their color pane, or like you can call it a color map. I've seen these things called slightly different things, but they're basically a visual representation of where pigments or paints are sitting relative to each other, and in terms of things like saturation and hue. I find this kind of helpful for myself to just kind of conceptualize this stuff. We are seeing our colors, how they're sitting relative to each other in terms of this circle view. And then if we look at the center versus the outskirts of the circle here, the center is where we have our desaturated colors. And then as we go out of the circle, that's where we're getting to our more saturated colors. So if we look here, we've got our white and our black, which are both definitely desaturated, as we talked about saturation earlier. And out here, we've got our stronger, more vibrant colors. If we look at this, I've got a cadmium deep red hue, and then I've got an alizarin crimson hue. This cadmium red deep hue is sitting a little closer to our orange hue than this one here is. And then if we go into a rose, permanent rose color, that is sitting even further away from that orange. It's sitting closer to this purple lake color. So just keep in mind that you can see these things kind of mapped out if you are not able to actually see them visually yourself. Because we're going to talk a lot about where colors sit relative to each other, and how that can help us with our predictions. So if you are someone who maybe has a little bit of color blindness or just a little bit of trouble seeing some of the distinctions that I'm going to talk about, this is one way to maybe approach that that might be better for you. Another thing I quite like about a visual like this is that it can help me to conceptualize a little bit about some of the possibilities with color mixing. So for example, if I were to mix these colors here together, so say I was to mix this yellow with this orange, I would expect that I'm going to be able to keep a relatively high saturation. I do want to stress that like in reality, color mixes are not like a straight line across just from one to the other. There's other things that kind of happen in there, but this is just as a very basic way of thinking about this stuff. Similar, if I was going to mix this orange hue with, say, one of these colors up here, I would anticipate that these would make a more vibrant color mix than if I were to mix this orange with this purple, if that makes sense. So if you can see, if I drew a line here, that line of possibility is going to be less saturated than over here. If I'm mixing with this green with yellow, I would anticipate this green, as I'm going more towards yellow, I'm going to be more saturated. But as I'm going from yellow to green, I'm going to kind of pull down in my saturation. So it's just another way for me to kind of make some possible guesses about what could happen when we mix colors together. And anytime we are mixing colors that are across from each other, even if it's just generally across, it doesn't have to be like directly across from, but anything in that general direction, we are going to be pulling that saturation down when we are mixing those two colors together. That's how I'm going to predict it, and this graph kind of helps me to make sense of that action happening. Another thing I quite like about this is a visual for a color mixing gamut. So if I were to connect the dots on the outside here, I would anticipate everything kind of in that shape that I have made to be within my color mixing gamut, hypothetically. And then anything on outside of that being way outside of the realm of possibility for me to mix. Not to say you'll be able to mix every single color within those connected dots, but there is at least some theoretical possibility of you getting there or getting close to there, if that makes sense. So just a few ways to think about this from a more broad perspective. Again, I'm not going super technical. I'm not going like super, super exact. This is just a way that helps me to wrap my head around it. There are some people who are way, way more nerdy about this color stuff than I am, but this is just a very basic way of looking at it. We're not getting super technical here. When we're talking about primary colors, I just think of them as the building blocks for making a lot of other colors. Um, the they're really just great colors to start off with for learning color mixing stuff. Another thing to understand with primary colors is that when we mix the three of them together, we get a desaturated and neutralized result. This is how we get browns. This is how we can get grays. We can also use this to our advantage when we want to make duller or desaturated versions of a color. When we have hints of the other primary colors in there, we can predict that we are going to have a more neutralized result. Another thing to be aware of is that some people like to label differences between cyan, magenta, and yellow, and red, yellow, and blue for the primary colors. And I just think being aware that both of those are great primary color places to start with, but that we can also get way more flexibility when we're not thinking in that rigid way. I just think of it as blue or cyan or whatever you want to call a bluish color. We've got red, or what's often called a rose, or a pink, or a magenta. Those all fit in this reddish category. And then we've got yellows that nobody seems to really debate. So just as an FYI, if you are using a rose-ish color, like a more pinkish color as your baseline for a red, you can make a more true red by mixing your rose color with a yellow. Okay, just so you are aware. So when we mix two primary colors together, we get secondary colors. So we can get a violet or a purple by mixing blue and red. We can get an orange by mixing red and yellow. Again, if we're using a rose, just the amounts that we're mixing, we can get either an orange or a more reddish color. And we can also get a green by mixing yellow and blue. So there are also what are called tertiary colors. We're just focused on primary and secondary, and that there are colors that exist beautifully in between, just depending on the ratios that we use. There are some more technical ways that we can map colors and where they sit next to each other, but for our purposes of what I'm going to kind of show you for predictions, this super, super basic version of basically a color wheel of where colors sit next to each other, relative to each other, this works for me. This keeps things simple. Our complementary colors are colors that sit across from each other on the color wheel. Really made basic. We've got our purple or violet is opposing our yellow, our blue or our cyan is opposing orange, and our green is going to be opposing the red, rose, magentas. So what is really key for understanding with color mixing is that when we combine two complementary colors together, they tend to neutralize, which sounds like something else. If we combine three primary colors together, they also tend to neutralize. But hey, if we actually break it down, every time we are combining two complementary colors, we are actually combining three primary colors. So if we look at red, we have red plus green. Green is really made up of yellow and blue. So we've got red plus yellow and blue tends to neutralize. If we look at orange and blue, we've got orange, which can be made up of the red and yellow, and then we've got blue. So we have all three primary colors at the party again. If we have yellow and purple, we've got yellow plus blue plus red, all three. So just remember that for when we're talking about our color mixing. This is going to make more sense for how we apply it as we go through this. So another thing I want us to just break down is color lean and color temperature. So colors are often described as either cool or warm. So our warm colors are our reds, our oranges, our yellows. These kind of just feel like warmer colors. They remind us of warmth. And then we've got our cooler colors, our violets, our blues, and our greens. And so if someone says, you know, you've got a cool color versus a warm color, that's generally what they're referring to. However, we also sometimes distinguish colors as being a warm or a cool version of that color. So most colors are not going to be strictly like a pure 100% version of that color. They usually have some influence from the colors next to it. So a blue might lean a little bit closer towards a green than it does to a purple. A purple might lean a little bit closer to a blue or a red. Just to kind of further illustrate this, I'm going to use an example with Daniel Smith's Watercolor Essentials Kit, which has a warm and a cool version of each primary. So I do just want to say, as I'm getting into this section, that not everyone is going to be able to see this in the same way. Depending on differences in how we actually perceive color, and just our vision differences. Like my partner has a really hard time with seeing any of this because he does have some partial color blindness. And for myself, even for me to learn how to see this stuff, it did take me a while. So if you don't right off the bat know how to identify your colors, you can check on manufacturers' websites. They'll sometimes list that stuff when they're giving you charts and stuff. You could also try putting your colors into a pigment chart and trying to figure it out that way. There are different ways to figure out what your colors are leaning towards or away from, or if they're warm or cool versions, without actually having to see it if you can't see it. So just want to make that clear. So as I go through this, if you can see that difference, great. If not, it's not the end of the world. You can still learn color mixing. This is just really helpful for making assumptions about how color mixes are going to look. To start out, we're just going to start with this red up here. So this red is called a warm red. The reason being, it is leaning more towards a yellow, which is a warm color, than it is to a blue, which is a cool color. I like to think of it as a color that leans more towards yellow than it does towards blue. Then if we go over here, we've got a yellow that almost looks orange. If we think about like where orange sits, it's sitting closer to the red. So that one's kind of an easy one to see, I feel, that this yellow is leaning more towards red. It's leaning further away from blue. Therefore, it's called a warm yellow. Again, just I like to think of where it's leaning closer to. This is a cooler yellow. You might not even be able to see that really well on the screen, but it is leaning more towards a blue than it is towards a red. So that's where I'm making that distinction. Now, blues are where this warm and cool really is silly because a cool blue leans more towards yellow, but yellow is a warm color. A warm blue leans more towards red, just because I guess red is stronger. I don't know. I guess you just have to remember. But for me, it's just easier to think a blue that leans towards yellow or a blue that leans more towards red. So when I am talking about color lean, if we're looking at it like this, it's kind of easier for me to identify that a blue is leaning closer to a red than to a yellow. But when I'm going into, say, a mixing kind of situation, then I find it easier to think both in terms of the color, the secondary color that it might sit next to, and the primary color. So as an example, for a blue, if I'm picking one that leans more towards red, it may look closer to a purple. If I'm picking one that looks closer to a green, it's closer to a yellow. So it's I kind of say both. So just to clarify, if I'm saying, it's a blue leaning towards purple or red, it's really meaning the same thing in my mind. It's just, for me, the visual connection is easier between a green and a purple, but the practical application is easier for me to make with the red or the yellow. So I like to think of this color lean as a sprinkle of other color in your colors. So if we think about a cool yellow leaning towards blue as kind of having yellow with a sprinkle of blue or a hint of blue. Red that's leaning towards yellow has a hint of a yellow or a hint of orange. Let's say I wanted to make a purple. I know that blue and red hypothetically make a purple, But if I am thinking about which colors to pick, I actually want to pick colors that are going to lean closer to that purple already if I have them. If I want a more vibrant color, if I want a more muted color, I want to go a little further away. And that kind of makes sense if we remember how we neutralize. So if we picked colors that were leaning towards that purple already, I would be picking these two colors. They're this cool red that's already leaning towards blue, and this warm blue that's already leaning towards red. We don't have a color lean towards purple's complement, which would be yellow. If we chose instead a warm red that leans towards yellow and a cool blue that leans towards yellow to make our purple, we're actually getting sprinkles of the complement in terms of where we're leaning. That can be helpful in determining how vibrant or dull a color is going to look. So that's what I put into practice over here. So first I did what I think would make the most muted. So I took a blue that was leaning away from where I want to go. So I took a blue that was leaning towards yellow, and then I took a red that's also leaning towards yellow. So it's going a little away from where I want to go. I'm mixing a little bit of that complement to purple in there, and I'm getting a pretty subdued outcome. And then if I pick what I think would look the most vibrant, I've got a warm blue, so a blue that's leaning more towards red, and a reddish color that's leaning more towards blue. And I am getting these purples. So when I was doing this little experiment, I accidentally like way diluted the blue I was using. So I did a few other examples just to better show you some of the purples that we can get with a blue that leans towards red and a red that leans towards blue. Hopefully giving you a little bit more of an idea of the saturation difference when it's not diluted. And just as an FYI, with each of these color mixes, I combined the two colors up top, and I tried twice with slightly different ratios just to show a couple of options in terms of what we can get. The options we can get are not limited to this. This is just a snapshot of what we can get. And then if we go over here, what I did was I did a little mixing and matching. So I took an ideal color for saturation and a less ideal color for saturation. So here I took a blue leaning towards yellow and a red leaning towards purple. So we've got a hint, just a teeny sprinkle of our lean towards the complementary color. So for this, we've got a bit of a subdued look, but we're still looking purple to me. And then as a contrast, if we took the blue leaning more towards where we want to go and a red leaning a little away, I got this. So again, quite neutralized, I would say, especially in certain ratios. I got basically a brown, and then I also got a grayish look. So interestingly, I find, especially for purples, rose colors carry a lot of weight. Like those really can give you a good purpley look. And part of it, I think, is also rose colors. Their pigment is actually sometimes a PV19, which is a violet already. So it really goes into purples quite well. So then over here, I did basically the same thing. I took a combination that I thought was going to make a fairly subdued color and then a more vibrant color and then the in-betweeners. So we've got here a blue that leans more towards red, which is the complement, and then a yellow that leans more towards red, which is again the complement. So we did get quite a murky-ish color here. And then we've got a yellow and a blue that are both leaning towards where we want to go. They don't incorporate kind of obvious sprinkles of the complement. And we've got quite bright green here. And then these ones, we've got a little mixing and matching. On the green side of things, for me, it's yellow that makes a big difference. Like the light, cool yellow really lends to quite nice greens. But at the same time, this can make for some really natural looking greens, you know? Like it just depends on what you're looking for, which colors I think you would gravitate towards. But you get that when you're experimenting. Speaking of experimentation, I've got this little experiment that I did when I was trying to get a grasp on color mixing predictions. So with this chart, I tried mixing primaries with other primaries, and I picked some colors that I didn't really know if I wanted to classify them as a primary or not, but I figured this would be a good chance to play with it. So I've got like this yellow ochre, which like is a yellow, but it also feels kind of browny. Same with the burnt sienna, which is a red pigment, but also feels like it's already leaning fairly desaturated. And then I also picked a purple lake purely out of curiosity because it had the same PV19 that quinacridone rose has. So I was just curious what difference I would see mixing a rose versus the purple lake, since they had the same pigment but look very different. And I indicated on here which primary color each color was leaning towards so that I could kind of make some predictions about which colors I thought would be more desaturated, which ones I thought would be more saturated. And I also thought it was interesting to see the trends in terms of which colors really seem to have a very strong pull, especially with like greens. I think it's very easy to see the role that like a bright yellow that's leaning cooler has on the greens that you can get. And same with the like rose colors, I think makes such a difference for purples. Overall, I really enjoyed this experiment just to see some of the variety in terms of things that I could make with just my primary colors. Obviously, this is just a snapshot of the combinations we could get combining any two primary colors. And, there's a wide range of things we could get with any two primary colors combined together. But I think it did still help me to identify some trends and to figure out which paint colors I really gravitate more towards when I'm paint mixing. I did also think it was really interesting to see how the like orangey colors that I was mixing with like the reddish colors and the yellowish colors, those like, all of them looked really good in my opinion. Like, it was just a section of that chart that just seemed to have these really lovely looking swatches. In summary, if we are trying to mix secondary colors or tertiary colors, those in betweens, you want to pick colors as your primaries that are leaning closer to where you want to go already to keep that saturation, to keep less of a drop in saturation. And we can think of this in terms of the sprinkles of other colors in there. If we're kind of leaning more towards a complementary color, if we're kind of leaning more towards having all three primary colors being involved, then we are going to have a chance of desaturation. Or we just think of it in terms of distance where they sit relative to each other on a plotted map, basically. To me, both of those help me to wrap my head around it. And another thing to keep in mind here is also that the saturation of your starting points is going to make a difference. If I mix with a desaturated paint like a burnt sienna or a yellow ochre, we can see that pull towards desaturation as a bit of a trend, regardless of the color that we are mixing with. We've also got the possibility of using as little water as possible. Sometimes when you're making mixtures and you're tweaking things, you have to add a little bit more paint after you've kind of figured out your combination, just because a little bit of water ends up getting in that mixture. And over time, you end up getting a lighter, more desaturated mixture than you wanted. Um, so sometimes mixing with tube paints can be helpful for keeping that high saturation as well, outside of those ways of retaining saturation. Another thing I just want to touch on here is analogous color mixing. So mixing colors that are sitting really close to each other on a color wheel, color map, whatever you want to call it, basically colors that are sitting close by. So a yellow mixed with an orange, or an orange mixed with a red, red mixed with purple, those just they just work very well. We're just kind I think of these as like nudges. We're just kind of like pushing things and pulling things into these in between zones, and we can make some really lovely things out of them. So, I also include in this category mixing paints that are in the same hue, like color category. It is totally okay to mix the same hues together, to mix like two blues together, to mix two greens together, and like greens and yellows. Like you absolutely can play with those, and you're just gonna get these lovely in between colors that like I can consider those like analogous color mixes still, where you're just nudging. And with those, you can really retain a lot of saturation. Sometimes we can actually boost it up. So it just kind of depends on the direction that you're pushing or pulling into with your mixes. So I find these little nudges quite lovely to play with sometimes. To me, I don't really put a label on them. I just like to think of them as like nudges into a certain direction or a certain color direction, if that makes sense. So now I want to talk a bit about what I call desaturation control, how we control bringing down that saturation if we want to. This is how we are going to be able to maintain more muted colors, more earthy colors. This might be really nice for when we are trying to paint more natural things, animals, people. It could also be really handy for when we want visual contrast. Saturation is lovely. I love beautiful saturated colors. However, contrast also is lovely. Contrast also is very visually appealing, and can make those vibrant colors almost feel louder if we have them against more muted or mousy kind of colors. So, I think this section is really important when we're thinking about color mixing. So obviously, we could already keep in mind the things we talked about, where if you're trying to mix a more muted purple, for example, the blues and the reds that you would pick would be different from the blues and the reds that you would pick if you were trying to go more vibrant. But there's also maybe times where you are using a convenience mixture of a purple, or where you've got a nice vibrant purple and you just want to bring it down a little bit. There's ways that you could also do that. And you also might just like prefer the look of a purple that's toned down in a slightly different way. So, we're going to talk about some of our options in terms of bringing saturation down and compare some of the looks of them, because I think that's kind of interesting too. To start off, we've already kind of talked about that complementary neutralizing, but let's just show you what that can look like. So, if we take a Viridian green hue, this is from Winsor Newton Cutman, just throwing that down there. Now let's mix that. Oops, I didn't need to wash that yet. So now let's mix this Viridian hue with a hint of red. And I could pick either one of these really. I'm going to just, you know what, we're going to try it with this one here. This rose color. And that brings things down. And I could do it with the other red as well. I'll just show you that. Sorry. Got our green. We're gonna get just a touch of red in here. And that's with the red. So rose, red. So that can be a great option, but there's actually some other ways we can modify some of our colors to make them look a little bit more natural or desaturated, that can look a little better than this. So especially for greens, what's kind of interesting is greens actually tend to look better if we mix them with a yellow and a red together, or an orange, which really, if you think of what an orange is, it is a yellow and a red. And I think that kind of works because we're dealing with a complement and then something to kind of boost the color up a little bit, especially with a green. A yellow kind of is huge for how a green looks, I find. Like, just that yellow content can make such a difference. So let's just try that again with the same green that I used before. I'm gonna take a bit of this green. I'm gonna mix it with one with yellow and a red or rose color, and then one with an orange that's already kind of straight out of the pan here. Okay, so let's start with an orange. Just getting a bit. Gonna bring it over here just so I can kind of control how much I put in if I want to put in a little bit more. And just mixing that in. So in my opinion, way, way nicer than just bringing it down with the complement with that green. And let's try it with a little bit more orange just to see. I feel like my first version of this looked a little, you know what? They're both not bad. I kind of like both of those. So yes, it neutralizes, but it also brings it in a different direction. You might find like you have a lot of uses for a green that looks like this, but for me, I way prefer a green that looks more like this. So just knowing how to kind of modify it, both toning it down a little bit, but also maybe adjusting the entire feel of the color. Let's try again with some yellow and red just to show you that. So I'm going to try it with the yellow and the rose color, I think, just for this one. Get some yellow on there. And I'll just show you, this is just with yellow, just to see what it's done without even the red being added to it. So it kind of actually brings it up a bit, specifically with like greens and yellow. They kind of have that relationship where the yellow can really kind of boost it up. But if we then take a red or a rose color and add a little bit of that in there, I'm going to get a little bit more. That might have been a little more rose than I needed, but that could be quite nice for some uses. If I add a little bit more green, we'll see what it looks like when it's got a little more green feel to it still. Goes over here. Yeah, it still needs a little more of the other guys. This can be a bit of a dance. This can be a bit of a guess in terms of which way we want to go, how much of which colors we want to add. And one thing when we're color mixing that I find can be kind of challenging is the ratio of water that we end up getting in our mixture. Sometimes the more colors you are getting, just if you're dipping in and out of water, you can sometimes end up diluting a little bit more than you mean to. So that's how we look with the rose and yellow mixed together with the green. So again, I would basically take pretty much any of these over where we started. And these ones are okay, but I could take it or leave it. So I started wondering like why this works so well for greens. And if it does work so well for greens, are there any other colors that we can apply similar logic to where we're neutralizing, but maybe we're also adding a little bit of other qualities to the color itself? So what I've determined is if we are using a secondary color to neutralize another secondary color, what happens is we're mixing a little bit of that complement. So we are leaning towards neutralizing when we're doing that, but we also are adding a touch more of one of the components of that color. So, as an example, if we mix orange and purple, we are mixing a bit of yellow, which is the complement, and also a bit of red, which is already in purple. So we get this kind of interesting effect happening where we're getting a bit of neutralizing, but we're also nudging that color a little more towards red as well. And keep in mind with this, I kept it straightforward. I didn't go into which way any of these colors are leaning. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could do that and probably get way more reliable predictions about the direction that that color is going to go. So that's kind of what I did also over on this sheet as an experiment to kind of figure that out. So I tried with one of my purples, just mixing with the secondary colors, so green and orange. And then I also tried between two different purples with two different yellows, just to see some of the differences in terms of what I could get. And for each of these, I did it 3 times just to see with different ratios some of the variance that we can get. So you'll see like over here with again that green, we're kind of getting a push towards more of a bluish grayish purple. And then over here, we're getting pushed more into a reddish or brownish kind of territory. So with the primary colors, I think just mixing with the complementary is your best bet. And then just keeping in mind that what you have as choices for your colors, the way that they lean will give you slightly different results depending on what your primary colors that you're using are and your complementary. Then down here, I also wanted to explore just adding some black to a color to kind of pull it down, which you can totally do. I feel like black gets a really bad reputation, but for some purposes, I think it can be totally fine. And then I wanted to kind of contrast that with neutral tint. So neutral tint is kind of similar to black in that it is basically a gray, a very neutral gray. And the one that I have is actually made up of 3 pigments. So it's actually been 3 pigments that have been perfectly balanced so that we don't see any one color in there. So we've got like a phthalo blue, a PB15 3, and then PR 122 and PY 42. So a red, a yellow, and a blue. So all 3 primaries are in there, giving us a full neutral. So when I found when I was comparing the neutral tint to the black when I was mixing them, the black does look to me at least a little bit flatter. The neutral tint for some reason prefer the look of slightly, but honestly, if you didn't have a neutral tint, I think these are similar enough that you could totally get away with just mixing with black. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about how we kind of lighten. So we can add white, which is called tinting, or we can add water. In watercolor, most commonly, we are diluting with water. So white does tend to add opacity to watercolors, which is not always something we want. But for really light pastel colors, I can see a reason to use it. And that reason is just basically when we add a certain amount of water, if we get too diluted, it is just like hard to control the paint. They're like really, I find things are just like there's too little pigment to water and it just is not pleasant to deal with. I'm guessing that if you added a little bit of gum arabic, that might help with that if you're going really diluted, but I'm not sure. I haven't experimented with that yet. But adding a little bit of white, I find just makes it easier to control lighter colors. So that's where I see a huge benefit in using white. So let's talk about mixing browns and grays. I think of browns and grays as neutrals. I'm going to call them neutrals. They're not perfectly balanced neutrals, but I'm still going to call them neutrals. I think of them as neutrals with a little bit of a lean towards a certain area. So for me, a brown I think of as a neutral that leans towards a warm color, a yellow, an orange, or a red. And then I think of grays as a neutral that leans more towards a cool color, a violet or a purple, a blue, or a green. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule because I think purples, in my opinion, are a bit of a wild card. Sometimes you'll have a neutral that leans towards purple and it feels more brownish, and sometimes you'll have a neutral that leans towards purple and feels more gray. But in general, I have consistently found this works very, very well for just knowing how to plan your direction and how to pivot if you need to. I also want you to keep in mind that the three primary colors combined together will tend to make a neutral or desaturated combination, and that two complementary colors will also do that. Another thing to keep in mind is that our starting saturation points do play a role in how easy it may be to get a desaturated combination. So, starting out with desaturated colors when we are mixing for a desaturated combination like a brown or a gray is likely going to be easier. Now, you can kind of approach how you do this mixture in several different ways. So, your first option I would say is to start with your closest to where you want to go already. So if you were trying to make a gray, I would say that would be mixing with a black or a neutral tint, and we could just add some blue into here or some purple into here and modify a gray quite easily just doing that. So I did that over here. So this was a black, this was a neutral tint, and I've added some purple into here, added some blues, added some purples, to just modify our grays that we have. We can also go about that with the brown side of things if we already have like a burnt umber, which is already a brown that we could just modify if we wanted to by adding some reds or something in there. We could also do that with a burnt sienna, changing this a little bit if we wanted to. Same with the yellow ochre. If we wanted to, we can use colors we can, if we have them, we can use these paints as a starting point and tweak them a little bit to get where we want to be. Your other options would be to do your mixtures. So you could go starting with just two complementary colors and see where that takes you, or you could start with three primary colors and see where that takes you. In my experience, when you're going about these mixtures, some work really well for specifically grays and aren't as lovely for browns, and then some are nicer for browns and not as nice for grays. This whole thing takes a lot of experimentation. One of the go-to combinations for making browns and grays that I have heard is mixing ultramarine and burnt sienna, and you can get grays and you can get browns with that combination. I'll show you a few examples of like me doing different mixtures and showing what I get for neutrals and just adjusting, because that's really, I think the key skill here is just knowing how to get close to where you want to go and then knowing how to adjust if you're not there, if you're not where you predicted you would go, how to compensate for that, and how to push things and pull things into different directions. What I'm going to show you first is if I was to try to make a gray, I can start with a blue. So I've got an ultramarine blue that I'm picking up here. I'm going to try it with this new gamboge just to show you how that looks. So this is a yellow. It's not quite an orange. So I might need to add a little bit of red in here. And I'm probably going to pick, because I'm going for a gray, I think I'm going to pick this rose, this quinacridone rose here, and then I'm just going to mix them all together and see what happens. And then from there, I can decide how I want to pivot. This is kind of like right between a brown and a gray to me, so I'm going to play around with that a little. Let's add a little bit more blue into here. That's looking a little bit more gray feeling than this one is. And I could add even just a little bit more with a hint of that rose. And there we've got more of a purpley gray. So I could tweak this now to go towards a brown if I wanted to. I'm going to add some more of that new gamboge. So we're going with our complement to the purple and getting a fair bit of that yellow in there. So that you could consider a brown. So I'm gonna add a little bit of this red now into here. And then I will try adding maybe a little bit of either blue or green. Let's try with the blue just to stick with the colors that we've already been using and just see that. So we've gone kind of all this way just by playing around with our proportions and tweaking things as we want to. So I can still make this go back to a gray if I wanted to. I'm even going to try with a little phthalo blue this time just to push it slightly differently. So we're just going to take a look at where that put us. So right now we've got kind of a desaturated green look to that. And I could tweak that a little bit. I'm going to add a bit of red. I'm going to add probably the rose actually. So that's the quinacridone rose that I'm adding here. And that feels like it's kind of grayed things down. Pretty nice. Like I said, if you have a black or a gray, you can play around with that too. I'm going to add a little black and just show you what that does. Just because that black kind of overtook that actually. So you can tweak it a little bit, add maybe a little bit of blue, and just see if that looks a little nicer for what you want. Lots of ways we can tweak that. So now I'm going to show you from a different starting point. So we're going to go from, I'm going to try this other blue. I started with ultramarine blue. I'm going to show you starting with a phthalo blue, just so we can see if there's any differences there. And again, I'm going to try and go gray, and then I'm going to try and go to brown, and then try and bring it back to gray. So I'm starting with this blue. I'm going to add some red and maybe a little bit of this new gamboge and see what happens. Just using that as a starting point. Just kind of eyeballing things. And we'll see what happens, and then we'll see how we have to pivot and go from there. It's looking a little greenish to me. The blue is pretty strong, actually. So we're going to add some more of the complements here. So I'm going to add a bit more of that new gamboge. Getting a little bit of that blue in there, but that's okay. We can always clean that out after. It's not a huge deal. Some red. And we're getting closer to a gray. I would say this is kind of a greenish gray. So if I wanted to neutralize that a bit more, I'm going to add a bit more red and just give that a go. Looking even more gray to me, so that's nice and neutral. Now, let's say I wanted that to be closer to a purpley or a bluey. I'm just going to add a little bit more of that. So I'm going to add a hint of the blue back in. And I'm also going to add a hint of the quinacridone rose rather than the red. This is such a mishmash. I know there's gonna be some people who really hate mixing that many colors together, but this is just to show you, like, the journey you can take it on, I guess. I have fun doing that. I don't really see a problem with it. So, yeah, brought that from greenish to purplish, and again, I just added a little bit more to push it in that direction. So now let's try and take that into a brown. So I've got kind of a purplish look here. So I'm going to try pushing that towards a reddish or yellowish. Let's try adding a bit of red to start, and we might add a little bit of that new gamboge in there too. Uh, which one was I? It was this one, right? I forgot which one I was doing. I think this is the one. I think. If not, whatever. We're still gonna just go towards brown. Um, Keeping in mind that this had kind of more of a purpley feel. So again, okay, I'm gonna dip into my red, add some of that in there. And then just alone with that, I could get a brownish red. And then I'm gonna just try pushing that towards yellow a bit. Using that new gamboge. I'm just using that because it is a more desaturated yellow. So I'm just trying to keep that desaturation in there. And I find it kind of makes for some murky mixtures, so it kind of works well for the browns. I actually quite like that. So there we've got almost what looks to me like a burnt sienna. I'll show you the burnt sienna beside it. And again, this is going by names, so different brands are going to have slightly different looking paints, but hey, hey, that's pretty close in my opinion. So I'm going to add some ultramarine blue into here. Already looking like a decent gray. I will say the one thing I don't love about ultramarines for grays and browns is that they do granulate. So they don't have a very uniform look to them. I did film some more of this brown and gray color mixing stuff, but I think I'm going to cut it off here for this video just for the sake of timing. Hopefully this has given you an idea in terms of how you can push and pull things in the direction that you need them in. And I did focus on using more saturated primary colors for this exercise just to show that you can get to these lovely grays and browns with a more saturated starting point. But you can totally make things easier on yourself sometimes by starting with a more desaturated color to start with. A burnt umber or a raw sienna, for example, might make your journey to where you want to go a little faster. But you can start in many different places and get to where you want to go. So hopefully this has helped you to feel more confident with your color mixing. I will also say experimentation is so key for getting a handle on this stuff. Play around, just feel free to break some rules, try tweaking things. I really like making little challenges for myself and like starting to think of this more as like a puzzle. Um, I have actually had a lot of fun doing that. So that's an option as well. And I think also just welcome playing around with adding some constraints. Try using a limited palette if you've never done that before. I personally found that made a huge difference for me getting more comfortable with color mixing. Let me know if you have any other things in the color mixing realm of things that you are struggling with. And hopefully this was helpful. Take care.